In a famous 1993 Korean film, a father deliberately blinds his own daughter. And he doesn't do it out of malice. He actually does it because he believes that only through profound, irreversible suffering can she truly understand the soul of traditional Korean art.
Yeah, it's a brutal concept, but it's deeply symbolic.
Right. Today, we're unpacking the cultural DNA of Korea, a nation where extreme trauma and fierce resilience are, practically identical. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are using Donald N. Clark's comprehensive book, Culture and Customs of Korea, as our grounding source today.
And it is such an incredibly dense, fascinating book.
It really is. Our mission today is straightforward. Whether you are prepping to do business in Seoul, or if you are fascinated by East Asian history, or just insanely curious about how societies function, we're going to extract the essential insights on how Korea evolved from this isolated hermit kingdom into a bifurcated modern powerhouse.
Exactly. It's about giving you, the listener, a real shortcut to understanding these invisible cultural forces. Everything from rigid family hierarchies to dynamic street art that drives the Korean peninsula today.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the physical reality of Korea itself. We are looking at a peninsula roughly the size of Minnesota, and the terrain is notoriously rugged.
Oh, it is severely mountainous.
Yeah.
Like the Taebaek Mountains run directly down the eastern spine of the peninsula like a jagged backbone.
Just a wall of rock.
Right. And because that terrain is so impassable, especially in the north and east, it historically forced the minority of the population southward and westward toward the flatter, more arable lands. If you want to understand Korean culture, you first have to understand this highly precarious real estate. Geography basically dictated almost every aspect of their historical development.
And from a geopolitical standpoint, outsiders have described that real estate using some highly aggressive metaphors. Neighboring empires called it a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan, or conversely, a tiger stalking toward the island nation.
Which perfectly illustrates how those neighboring empires viewed the peninsula, right? Korea was rarely viewed as a sovereign partner. It was seen either as a direct threat or a really convenient stepping stone for conquest.
Because of its location.
Exactly. Wedged right between the massive land power of China and the rising naval power of Japan. So Korea absorbed constant historical invasions. You have the Khitans in the 900s, the Jurchen in the 1100s, the destructive sweep of the Mongols in the 1200s, and the Manchus in the 1600s.
Wow, that is just a relentless timeline of conflict. Not to mention the devastating Japanese invasion in the 1590s. Though that specific conflict highlights a phenomenal mechanism of underdog ingenuity.
Oh, you're talking about the naval defense?
Yeah, the Korean Admiral Yi Sun-sin. He defended the peninsula using turtle ships, or kobuksan. He placed these spiked, metal-clad canopies over the decks of his wooden boats to deflect flaming arrows and boarding parties.
The visual of that alone is incredible.
Right. But the real genius wasn't just the armor, it was the propulsion. While the bulky Japanese ships relied heavily on sails and wind, Yi Sun-sin used oarsmen safely protected below deck.
So they weren't at the mercy of the weather.
Exactly. This gave his ships wind-independent mobility. They could rapidly outmaneuver the clumsy Japanese fleets in these narrow, shifting coastal straits and entirely sever their supply lines.
It was just a brilliant tactical adaptation to their environment. But taking a step back, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this constant need to adapt and defend perfectly illustrates a unique cultural fatalism and resilience. Korea historically functioned as, well, you had a great analogy for this earlier.
Oh, yeah. Like being the middle child in a very rough neighborhood.
Yeah.
Caught right between China and Japan, constantly having to absorb shocks or play brilliant defense just to ensure their survival.
Yes, the middle child. And the way they manage that survival long term is fascinating.
Yeah.
Because you can't just fight naval battles forever, right?
You'd run out of resources completely. So how did they survive?
You manage it through a highly calculated geopolitical strategy. Take the Chosun dynasty, which ruled for a staggering 518 years, from 1392 to 1910. Their primary survival strategy was a policy called Sade, which translates roughly to serving the great.
Serving the great. So they leaned into submission.
They essentially positioned themselves as a peaceful, submissive younger brother to Ming Dynasty China. By voluntarily accepting a subordinate position, adopting Chinese calendar systems, and paying regular tribute, they ensured that China didn't perceive them as a threat.
Wow.
Yeah, this deference bought them the crucial autonomy they needed. It let them rule themselves internally and cultivate a distinct culture without the constant looming threat of Chinese annihilation.
Okay, so if your external borders are constantly being breached or threatened by Mongols and Japanese armies, and your foreign policy relies on submission, How do you prevent your own society from collapsing into chaotic resentment? You have to build an ironclad internal structure, right? And for Korea, that internal operating system was Confucianism. Now, people often classify Confucianism as a religion, but the source text emphasizes that it functions much more as a humanist social ethic.
That is the defining distinction, for sure. Confucianism places very little emphasis on the afterlife or deities. Its sole focus is achieving absolute harmony in this life, within the community and within the state.
Okay, but how does it achieve that harmony?
Through a strict architecture of inequalities. Confucius taught that humans are fundamentally not equal, and society only functions smoothly when everyone acutely understands their rank. This is codified in the 5 relationships.
Right, the 5 relationships. That's ruler and subject, father and son, older and younger, husband and wife, and friend and friend.
Exactly.
And looking at that list, with the sole exception of friend to friend, every single one of those relationships is explicitly unequal. The weaker party owes absolute submission to the stronger, while the stronger party is obligated to provide nurture and protection to the weaker.
It creates a very clear top-down flow of responsibility and deference.
And the familial application of this is intensely deep. The text details this concept of unhai, which translates to the grace or debt owed to one's parents. This debt is culturally defined as being deeper than the ocean. It is fundamentally unpayable.
It's a permanent state of obligation.
Yeah, and this isn't merely an abstract philosophical idea. This hierarchy is physically hardwired into the mechanics of the Korean language. I mean, you cannot speak a sentence without adjusting your verb endings and honorifics based on whether the person you are speaking to is older or holds a higher social rank than you.
Historically, that strict linguistic and familial hierarchy mapped directly onto the national class system, too. At the top, you had the Yangban, the aristocratic ruling class.
But it wasn't just inherited wealth.
No, not just bloodline. To hold government office, a Yangban male had to pass these grueling, high-stakes civil service exams, and those exams were based entirely on memorizing and interpreting Confucian classics. The logic was that a society ruled by a highly educated elite would ensure that only the most moral, disciplined individuals were directing the nation.
I need to challenge this system, though. If your entire life is governed by strict rank, honorifics, and an unpayable debt to your family lineage, doesn't that completely suffocate individuality? I mean, from a modern perspective, it sounds like the average person was merely a cog in a perpetual familial machine with basically no room for personal ambition.
Well, it absolutely eliminates individual freedom in the way a Western post-Enlightenment thinker would define it. In a traditional Confucian framework, you are not an isolated unit making decisions for your own happiness. You are a temporary custodian of your family's lineage.
A temporary custodian, that's heavy.
It is. However, in exchange for surrendering that individual autonomy, the system provides an unparalleled, unbreakable safety net. You are never abandoned. You operate within a dense web of mutual obligation. And this deeply ingrained trait, this intense sacrificial loyalty to parents, teachers, and superiors, is what sociologists call the Confucian ethic.
Which, as we'll see later, becomes the exact engine for their modern economy. But before we get to the 20th century, we have to look at the counterbalance to this rigid system. Because a society cannot survive purely on strict patriarchal rationality. It needs a pressure valve for raw emotion.
Yes, the human element has to go somewhere.
Exactly. The text contrasts Confucianism with Korea's deeply mystical spiritual outlets, starting with shamanism.
Shamanism is recognized as the indigenous, ancient spiritual bedrock of Korea. While Confucianism dealt with statecraft and intellect, shamanism dealt with the visceral, everyday terrors of agrarian life. Disease, barrenness, bad luck, and appeasing angry ghosts.
The stuff that actually kept regular people awake at night.
Exactly. And crucially, while Confucianism was strictly male-dominated, shamanism was driven almost entirely by women. These women were known as mudangs, and they performed elaborate ecstatic rituals called kut.
And the mechanism of how a woman became a mudang is just fascinating. It wasn't a career choice you just applied for. Women were often driven into the role by a severe emotional or psychological breakup. A spirit sickness called shinbyeon.
Right. It was seen as a calling that you couldn't refuse.
They essentially had to undergo a profound personal fracturing before they could serve as a conduit for the spirits. So alongside shamanism, you also have Buddhism, which provided a massive channel for artistic and cultural devotion.
Oh, the artistic achievements of Korean Buddhism are staggering.
The text highlights the 8th century Sokaram cave, featuring this masterful granite Buddha gazing out over the East Sea, and of course the Tripitaka Koreana.
The Tripitaka is just one of the most remarkable artifacts in human history. During a brutal period of Mongol invasions in the 13th century, Korean Buddhists spent years hand-carving their entire canon of scriptures into 84,000 wooden printing blocks.
Wait, hold on. They meticulously carved 84,000 wooden blocks while their country was actively being invaded and burned. That sounds like a disastrous misallocation of wartime resources. I mean, why pull thousands of able-bodied men away from the front lines or agricultural production to do intricate woodworking?
From a purely secular militaristic viewpoint, it makes zero sense. It sounds crazy. But you have to understand the mechanism of state protection Buddhism. The leaders genuinely believed that the invasion was a spiritual failing.
Oh, so the blocks were the solution.
Right. Carving the Tripitaka wasn't just making books, it was a nationwide act of karmic mobilization. They believed that this monumental demonstration of devotion would literally compel the Buddha to intervene and repel the Mongol armies. It was spiritual warfare materialized in wood.
That perfectly highlights the duality of the culture. You have the strict calculating logic of the Yangban organizing the government, operating right alongside a populace mobilizing spiritual magic to fight wars. But what happens when that complex, centuries-old operating system gets violently stress-tested by modern imperialism?
The whole system fractures.
Yeah, moving into the 20th century, we see this cultural identity fighting for its literal survival, beginning with the Japanese colonial period from 1910 to 1945.
And we have to be clear, this wasn't merely a political occupation. It was a systematic campaign of cultural erasure. The Japanese colonial government sought to annihilate Korean identity and assimilate the population entirely into the Japanese empire.
And the mechanisms of this erasure were aggressively thorough. They banned the teaching of Korean history, outlawed the Korean language in schools, forced citizens to worship at Japanese Shinto shrines, and eventually mandated that Koreans legally change their names to Japanese ones.
It was an attempt to wipe the slate entirely clean.
Ironically, though, this aggressive suppression caused a radical shift in Korea's religious landscape. Christianity, which had historically been viewed with deep suspicion and violently persecuted in Korea, suddenly transformed into a vehicle for nationalism.
Right, because Western missionaries operated Christian schools and hospitals.
Exactly. The church became a sanctuary for modern education and quiet resistance against Japanese domination. It intertwined faith with Korean independence. This actually explains why South Korea has a prominent Christian population today, whereas the religion never gained significant traction in neighboring China or Japan.
It became synonymous with survival and resistance.
Yeah. But if we were talking about resistance, here's where it gets really interesting. We have to talk about language. Back in 1446, King Sejong the Great oversaw the invention of a brand new phonetic alphabet called Hangul.
A truly brilliant linguistic invention.
The text notes it is highly scientific, but what makes it scientific is the actual anatomical design. The shapes of the consonants literally mimic the physical positions your tongue, palate, and teeth make when pronouncing those specific sounds. It is a masterpiece of linguistic engineering designed to be learned in days.
Yet upon its creation, the elite Yangban class fiercely rejected it.
Why, if it's so easy to learn?
Because they viewed Hangul as dangerously simple. They preferred the punishing complexity of traditional Chinese characters because literacy functioned as a barrier to entry. It protected their elite status and their monopoly on government power.
Ah, so making it easy to read threatened their power.
Precisely. Consequently, for centuries, this brilliant alphabet was relegated to the margins, kept alive primarily by women writing diaries and commoners writing folk tales.
But flash forward to the Japanese occupation in the 20th century. When the Japanese government attempted to outlaw the Korean language, that exact alphabet, once dismissed by the aristocracy as a women's script, suddenly became the ultimate underground weapon.
Yes.
Teaching and writing in Hangul became a profound act of defiance and cultural preservation.
It perfectly demonstrates how a marginalized cultural tool can be weaponized for survival. Unfortunately, though, the survival of the culture did not lead to peace. Following the liberation from Japan in 1945, the peninsula was arbitrarily sliced in half by the United States and the Soviet Union at the 38th parallel.
A completely artificial division.
Right. And this rapid division triggered the devastating Korean War from 1950 to 1953. We are reporting this impartially based on the text, but the destruction was near absolute on both sides.
Now, we all know the geopolitical history of the war, but the cultural impact is what demands our attention. The absolute devastation of the peninsula essentially wiped out the remaining structures of the traditional Yangban aristocratic class. By reducing everyone to shared rubble, the war inadvertently leveled the social playing field.
It hit a giant tragic reset button.
Exactly. It created a brutal blank slate which South Korea eventually utilized to execute a hyper-accelerated pivot to a capitalist meritocracy.
And that pivot is often termed the economic miracle. But there was nothing miraculous about the mechanism driving it. It was fueled by staggering human endurance. The South Korean government established aggressive export quotas and funneled capital into cables.
The cables, like Samsung and Hyundai.
Yes, massive family-controlled corporate conglomerates.
And the growth of these cables relied entirely on a labor force performing 3D jobs. That's difficult, dirty, and dangerous. We aren't just talking about a strong work ethic here. We're talking about young women in textile factories working 16-hour shifts, consuming stimulant pills just to stay awake to ensure their factory met the government's export targets.
The sacrifice was immense.
And culturally, they took that intense Confucian ethic, the unwavering loyalty and submission to the father figure, and transplanted it directly into the corporate structure. The company president became the strict father, the employees became the dutiful children, and they sacrificed their individual well-being for the lineage of the corporation. They effectively rebuilt a modern Yangban class in the boardroom.
Wow. They channeled that middle child survival instinct we discussed earlier, the need to constantly outmaneuver larger threats, and aimed it squarely at the global manufacturing market.
It's incredible. But what about the North?
Well, meanwhile, the northern half of that middle child took a completely divergent survival route, absolute isolation. In North Korea, Kim Il-sung developed a state philosophy called Juche, which translates to fierce self-reliance.
Right.
After centuries of foreign domination, the logic was that North Korea would sever itself from the global system, produce its own food, manufacture its own weapons, and rely on no one.
You know, when analyzing North Korea, it is very tempting for Westerners to view it simply as a textbook, Soviet-style political dictatorship. But the source material digs deeper.
It does. What's fascinating here is how the text examines the phenomenon of Kim Il-sungism and traces its wiring directly back to the traditional Confucian hierarchy and the Japanese imperial cult. Remember, the founders of North Korea did not experience the Enlightenment or democratic revolution.
Right, they were raised under Japanese occupation.
Exactly. They came of age under the Japanese emperor system, which indoctrinated citizens to believe they were literally the hands and feet of a divine ruler's body.
So the regime essentially just swapped out the Japanese emperor for Kim Il-sung, but they left the underlying psychological and social wiring completely intact.
Precisely. A striking demonstration of this deeply ingrained Confucian wiring occurred when Kim Il-sung died in 1994. His son, Kim Jong-il, did not formally assume the title of president for 3 years.
3 whole years.
Yes. Western political analysts immediately assumed this delay indicated a fierce behind-the-scenes power struggle, but viewed through a strict Confucian lens, it was the ultimate necessary display of filial piety.
Oh, because of the mourning period.
Exactly. A dutiful son is required to mourn his father for 3 full years, avoiding the spotlight and honoring the patriarch. He intentionally delayed his official ascension as an act of traditional Orthodox mourning.
Wow. If you strip away the Confucian context, you fundamentally misread the geopolitical action. That is wild.
It really is.
So this brings us to a critical question. How does a population process this relentless sequence of events? Centuries of foreign invasion, a suffocating social hierarchy, the trauma of cultural erasure, a fratricidal war, and the ongoing bleeding wound of a divided nation. According to the text, the pressure valve for all of this collective agony is their deeply emotional, visceral art.
Yeah, art in Korea has never been merely decorative. It functions as a mechanism for survival. It provides a sanctioned space to vocalize the suffering imposed by daily life. A prime example is pansori.
That's the traditional form of epic storytelling, right?
Yes, performed by a single vocalist and a percussionist, which can last for up to 8 grueling hours.
The vocal style alone sounds like tearing velvet. It is so raw and strained. And the most famous pansori narrative is the tale of Chunhyang.
Oh, that's a classic.
She is a commoner, the daughter of an entertainer, who secretly marries the son of a powerful Yangban official. When her husband leaves for the capital to take his civil service exams, a corrupt, tyrannical governor arrives in her town and demands she become his concubine.
Which she refuses.
Right. Despite brutal torture and imprisonment, she refuses, maintaining her fierce loyalty to her husband. Ultimately, the husband returns, disguised as a secret government inspector, overthrows the corrupt governor, and rescues her.
Now, on the surface, it is a classic romantic trope. Good triumphs over evil. But its enduring cultural power lies in its subversion. It allowed audiences of oppressed commoners to vicariously experience a powerless woman defeating a corrupt member of the elite Yangban class. It was a safe, artistic way to triumph over severe social injustice.
Which brings us back to the hook we opened with. The 1993 cinematic masterpiece, Sopyeonjae, focuses on an itinerant family of pansori singers. The stepfather is desperate to teach his stepdaughter the art form, but he feels her singing lacks the true, bottomless sorrow known as hand required to be authentic.
So he takes drastic measures.
Right. He intentionally feeds her a toxic medicine that destroys her eyesight. He steals her vision so that she will experience a suffering so profound it allows her to transcend her physical limits and channel the true voice of the culture.
It is a harrowing narrative mechanism. Yet the film resonated so deeply that it became a massive cultural phenomenon in South Korea. It articulated a core truth. The art isn't about achieving technical perfection, it is about serving as a vessel for collective historical agony.
So what does this all mean? The closest analogy that comes to mind is the origin of the American blues. It is art forged in the crucible of such profound systemic suffering that the pain itself is alchemy. It transforms into a source of supreme emotional strength. The suffering becomes the very glue of cultural unity.
That is a highly accurate parallel. Historically, Korean folk art served as the undisputed voice of the oppressed. Consider the traditional village mask dances.
Oh, the ones with the exaggerated faces.
Yes. Commoners would wear these exaggerated, grotesque masks and perform satirical, slapstick plays that ruthlessly mocked the hypocritical Yangban aristocrats and corrupt Buddhist monks. They used humor to dismantle power.
That makes a lot of sense.
And if you fast forward to the violent military dictatorships in South Korea during the 1980s, you see the exact same mechanism in the people's art movement. These bold, aggressive paintings and street theater protesting labor exploitation and demanding democratic elections. The art is inextricably bound to the struggle of the commoner against unyielding elites.
And you can witness all these historical layers interacting simultaneously if you visit Taehangno or University Street in modern Seoul. The text vividly describes this urban landscape where ancient Samulnori percussion troops, whose rhythmic drumming evolved directly from agrarian farmers' music perform side by side with youth crews breakdancing to hip-hop and rock.
They haven't discarded their past, they've simply paved over it and built the present directly on top of the ancient foundations.
The percussive rhythms that mobilized farmers centuries ago literally provide the backbeat for the modern metropolis. We have charted a complex course today. We examined how the impassable geography of the peninsula forged a hyper-resilient society that had to constantly outmaneuver neighboring empires.
It's all connected.
We explored how the strict, unequal relationships of Confucianism provided an ironclad social structure, while the emotional release of shamanism and Buddhism provided spiritual defense. And we unpacked how the severe traumas of colonization, division, and war were ultimately metabolized into both a hyper-accelerated modern economy and deeply transcendent art.
It requires a significant shift in perspective to fully grasp. But as we conclude, this raises a vital, lingering question derived from everything we've unpacked today. We discussed the concept of unhai, that fundamental, unpayable debt owed to one's parents. We also established that the primary duty of a child within the Confucian operating system is to maintain the family lineage and revere the ancestors.
Right. The unbroken family unit is the absolute center of gravity.
So project that cultural mandate onto the current division of North and South Korea. Today, there are millions of divided families separated by the militarized border. As the older generations who personally lived in a unified Korea pass away, how will this ancient, ingrained sense of familial obligation manifest in the youth of today?
That is a fascinating question.
Will the ultimate catalyst for reunification on the peninsula stem not from geopolitical strategy, military threats, or economic incentives, but from a deeply seated cultural Confucian guilt? A fundamental, inescapable need to heal the broken family of the nation before the ancestors are completely forgotten.
That is a staggering thought to consider. It fundamentally reorients how you view the map. When you look at a geopolitical globe, you just see the stark binary line of the 38th parallel. But flowing beneath that border, driving the modern economies and the political posturing, are those deep, complex cultural currents of filial duty, hierarchy, and shared historical trauma. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep looking past the map, and we will catch you next time.